Okay, so we're in we're up to chapter 16 now, so we can do this. The title of the chapter is Diminishment, and it's a process, or it's a phenomenon. It's sort of a judgment call with regard to whether or not a reservation exists or not. Okay, so diminishment is it's important as a facet of mostly legal or criminal jurisdiction, right? But also regulatory issues. So a reservation that has lost its most of its trust land and the maybe the population, the Native American population on the reservation is like below 20%. Should that remain a reservation? The Solemn versus Bartlett case is the one that's provided in your readings, and when a reservation was allotted, right? Allotments are made, and then you have the so-called surplus lands that are opened up by the government for settlement and homesteading or sale. And those surplus lands, legislation that opens up the surplus lands is usually the make or break rule. The Surplus Land Act, of whatever it may be called, is the wording in it will often determine whether or not a reservation may be designated as diminished, or, as we'll see later, disestablished. Well, what does diminishment even mean? Is it, and I guess probably the best thing we could do is talk about the example of Indian Territory, right? Because it's the most relevant to us. It's not mentioned in your text because it was being litigated at the time this text was being published, which was only last year. But the question as to whether or not a parcel of land is Indian country is what we're getting at, and it's only referring to reservations and past reservations. Okay, so in the case in the example of Solemn versus Bartlett, dealt with the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation and whether or not it was had been allotted into oblivion or not. The important thing to remember about this example is that the test for diminishment is often determined by the surplus land laws, each of which were pretty unique. Okay, and unfortunately, whether or not a reservation has been diminished will usually depend on the use of certain words in the legislation. All right, and when you read a Surplus Land Act, an SLA, which was what opened up the land to non-Indians, opened up a reservation. Okay, the language that is most critical is, well, there are two things. If there's any mention in the act that the surplus lands are a cession of land. If the act says that the surplus lands are now ceded, and if there is any specified monetary compensation for the surplus lands, then that reservation has been dissolved, or at least diminished. And that's what's really intriguing about the McGirt decision and the declaration of the Creek Nation as a reservation that has not been disestablished. Um, there was no, there was a, this test was used to determine if the Creek Nation still existed as a reservation, even though for 120 years, the state of Oklahoma has presumed that it didn't. The test was basically if there was a cession of land to the United States, or if there was compensation to the United States for the land. And in the case of the five tribes, in the case of the five tribes, the argument that the state used to use to say that the five tribes' territories were gone was that they received a patent to the land. And if we look at the test that was developed for reservations up in South Dakota, right, then it makes all the sense. It makes sense that the Indian territory would still be Indian country and still be reservation, because when the five tribes allotted, remember how they were. I'm kind of getting off track, but I'm going to explain this. All right. I think it makes more sense than looking at this particular case. But read that case carefully. It's a good one. I mean, it's important in describing things. In the case of the five tribes, they were exempted from the 1887 Dawes Act, right? And the law that forced them to allot, or forced them to come to the table and negotiate agreements for allotment, that was the Curtis Act, right?
Curtis Act, yeah.
The Curtis Act forced the tribes to the table. None of the tribes allotted under the Curtis Act, which was a lot more, severe. Well, each of the five tribes had allotment agreements in which every square inch of the territory was allotted to tribal members. All right. So it was, or at least in theory. So there were no surplus lands whatsoever. Therefore, there was no language in there was no surplus land agreement. Let's just say that. There was no surplus land agreement with regard to Indian territory. The five tribes did not have surplus lands. Therefore, no surplus land agreement. And if no surplus land agreement, there was no language about a cession, and there was certainly no compensation. Therefore, Indian territory is still an Indian reservation. All right.
So good for them based on, and actually that's honestly to the letter of, to me, that would be like to the letter of the law. There was really no getting around that then based on that explanation and those acts. And no one really had the foresight later to revisit it. So,
I mean, I've known the history of the allotment among the five tribes for 35 years, 35 years, but it's only struck me just now in class that there was no surplus land agreement. Therefore, there was no language that this test was new, right? This test is just recent, but they're basing all of this on something that is completely irrelevant to the five tribes. But I'll take it.
Yeah, why not?
It's kind of interesting. The question now, Sarah, can I ask you a question about the Osage?
Shoot.
Is the Osage, you know how on road maps of Oklahoma, if y'all ever saw road maps, probably too young. A road map of Oklahoma from like 20 years ago would show one Indian reservation, and it would say the Osage Reservation. It would be Osage County would be like shaded pink or something. And so when most people would look at the roadmap, the state roadmap of Oklahoma, they would say, oh, well, there's one Indian reservation in Oklahoma, and it's the Osage Reservation right here. Okay. However, a few years ago, there was a case that, as I understood it, and I haven't read the case, but as I understand the findings, they found the Osage Reservation to have been disestablished. But it's interesting, the roadmap's going to have to change now. So
Yeah.
we have 5 new reservations. Well, all right, we got through that technically. All right, well, I'll see y'all. I'll put it up and just give me a call if y'all have anything you want to discuss or work on. Okay. Night, night. See you
All
guys.
right, thank you.